Alright, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to go over the next topic. So the next topic is we're now going to talk about the connection between drugs, so mainly recreational drugs, what they do in the body, and how they affect your subconscious. And pretty much why people take them, which we already know, but we're going to talk about more from the perspective of the subconscious, right? So just to go over this first point, so it says, although we'll be talking about charging the subconscious with the mind, it is also possible to charge the subconscious with the body, which we've already said. But what I'm really meaning by that is that everything I'm kind of talking about in the book, about charging your subconscious for the purpose of feeling more joy or more emotional pleasure, which emotional pleasure is really just picking a positive emotion, charging it more and more and more so you feel it more and more intensely, right? And the more intensely you feel that positive emotion, the more pleasurable it feels, right? So when you're having a lot of fun, right, you're feeling the fun emotion very intensely. So you feel it feels like pleasure, a form of pleasure. When you're happy, right, or you're laughing, right, so or even when you feel gratitude or sense of inner peace. So any form of emotion, positive emotions, right, that you have charged at very intense levels will feel like a form of emotional pleasure. So people like that, right? They want to feel that, or you can do it for the purpose of performance, right? Whether you're doing it for emotion or performance, you have to charge the subconscious more and more. Now the problem, right, is that charging the subconscious through the mind takes a lot of time, so it's a much slower process. But like I said before, that's the con, but the pro is that you can charge it for a much wider array or range of things. Charging to the body is much quicker, but you can only charge it for a much limited amount of things. But there's another con to it, right? But just to say, before I even get into that, the ideas that we're talking about charging for emotional pleasure or performance have really been around, I would guess, for thousands of years. But maybe not in the ways that we're speaking about it, but they have been around. And what a lot of people have done, right? And some people have done this through the mind, through meditation and things like that. We'll talk about what actually happens in meditation, which we're going to basically look much deeper into the mechanics of that in chapter 8 of book 1. But, so some people have still done these stuff through the mind on a conscious level in terms of meditation. But what they also have done is pretty much everything we're talking about in terms of charging the subconscious to do certain things. They've done it through the body instead, right? So, just to go to the second, so it says, the second point, the body can be hacked to charge, wrote it kind of weird, the body can be hacked to charge for emotion and performance. So in other words, people have always been kind of doing, like I said, what I'm teaching you how to do to control your subconscious for emotion or performance, they've been doing for thousands of years, just doing it through the body instead of the mind, right? There's a problem with that, right? So there's a huge problem with doing that. But the main key that they use to achieve that is drugs, recreational drugs. So what do drugs do? How do they cause your body to charge your subconscious? Well, drugs are able to alter how the brain regulates neurotransmitter levels. And this is just my understanding. I'm not a neuroscientist, so it could be hormones too. But they alter how the brain regulates neurotransmitter levels. And this is generally done to make brain tissue more active and charge the subconscious more intensely. So like I said before, the basic theoretical framework that we're working from is that some tissue in the brain, right, there's lots of different brain tissues that do different things, but some tissue in the brain is responsible for charging your subconscious in a specific way. In your ground state, all types of brain tissues all work together to charge the subconscious at a certain level of intensity and for certain activities. And all of that is regulated by your neurotransmitter levels. And so your brain has to make sure neurotransmitters don't allow, well, before I get into that, the activity or the intensity of the charge, right, is controlled by neurotransmitters that become active, right? So when they become active, when they bind to certain receptor sites in the brain, and that makes the tissue more active and charge the subconscious more intensely. So obviously, for this to work properly, so the subconscious doesn't charge too much or too little, the brain has to make sure that only a certain number of receptor sites are active, right, at a time. So it has to make sure that there's not too many neurotransmitters binding to receptor sites, and also make sure that there's not enough neurotransmitters binding to receptor sites. So that's homeostasis, which that's one which I mentioned here, which we'll get to that part. But so the body makes sure that not too much is going on. It has to be in the kind of Goldilocks range, right? So when I say Goldilocks range, I think most people know what I mean by that. It has to be just right. And what drugs do, right, they alter this, right? So drugs, like a lot of time, and I'll just go over the point here, many recreational drugs prevent the reuptake of dopamine, right? And this causes this causes brain tissues responsible for charging pleasure to become more active. So in other words, a lot of drugs, cocaine, methamphetamine, other ones, a lot of them, what they end up doing is they like to affect the neurotransmitter dopamine. Because dopamine, as far as I know, it's generally related to a feel-good feeling, right? So when dopamine binds to receptor sites in the brain, some tissues, whatever, I don't know, some tissues become active, and that generally charges your subconscious to feel good, right? To feel better. And so now you could feel good just charging the subconscious through your intention, right? And you don't need the body to do anything. In fact, your body expects that. Your body expects for the mind to be doing a million different things to charge your subconscious. It's not supposed to be charging here through the body. But if you use drugs, that's what will happen. And so drugs prevent, I think when neurotransmitters, actually let me get into it, when neurotransmitters bind to certain receptor sites, they become active, the tissue becomes active and charges the subconscious, but then eventually they leave, right? So they leave and then they're recycled. And there's certain, I read this a long time ago, but your body basically does certain things to cause those neurotransmitters to basically go back into a passive state, right? So they're no longer binded to the receptor site, and they're prevented from binding back to receptor site until some new activity happens. So that's a form of regulation to make sure that the dopamine isn't too active or overactive, or the tissue related to that dopamine activity isn't overactive, right? And drugs like methamphetamine prevent that from happening. So what ends up happening is too much dopamine becomes active, or a lot of dopamine becomes active at the same time. This causes the brain tissue to charge the subconscious more intensely, and you end up feeling really, really, really good, right? And so that's basically the whole idea behind recreational drugs. And I don't know about other drugs like ecstasy and things like that. They can charge, they charge different, they cause different sites in the brain to charge up. So I hear ecstasy makes you feel like you're in love, right? And more like aroused. So it could be a range of different emotions, right? Your brain is kind of, your brain basically is aware in the sense of all of them, right? And I imagine there's some part of the brain that activates in response to different emotions. But just in terms of primal emotions and things like that, your brain only really cares about charging a few of them on its own, right? So it goes out of its way to make sure a few get charged. The rest of them just get charged primarily by the mind, and the brain just kind of follows it a little bit. So if let's say I charge the feeling of having fun, some part of my brain probably reacts to that, but it hasn't evolved to try to charge that emotion on its own. Drugs hack the process and try to get the brain to charge different emotions. Now, in a sense, right, there's an advantage to that, right? Because exactly what I said before, the body charges the subconscious very quickly. So if you take a drug, you'll usually feel pretty good pretty fast, right? And that's called a high, right? When you feel the good feeling part of taking drugs. And so charging through the mind, on top of it taking much longer to do and taking more work, it also requires more knowledge of how the brain works, right? So how the subconscious works in relation to the conscious mind. So that's something most people don't really know, right? And that's actually the whole idea of this whole theory and everything that we're learning here, is to teach you how to charge the subconscious, really how to control it using your intention, right? Now, although most people don't really know it in the way that we're studying here, there's certain, I don't know if I can say this word, tangential, I can never say it, but you get what I'm saying. There are certain understandings that they will have and they'll come across that they can run almost parallel in many ways to what we're talking about, even if it's not the whole theory. So, for example, they would learn certain things about meditation, or they'll recognize that certain activities make them feel a certain way, or even when they're around certain people, they feel a certain way, right? And so what they're really doing is just focusing on external factors that help them to get them to produce the proper intention to quantize their subconscious and charge it properly, right? Now, you're way more in control of the process once you just know how the theory works completely. But it's still kind of a lot to do through the mind. So doing it through the body is a shortcut. Now, as with any shortcut, right, there's always going to be a downside that pretty much makes it not worth it. Unless it's like traveling, right? Traveling is probably good to take shortcuts. So, just to go to this next point, charging through the body disrupts homeostasis. So this causes the body to resist, leads to the body reducing neurotransmitter receptor sites called downregulation, and eventually leads to withdrawal. So in other words, this is nothing new. Everyone knows this. So now I'll go through it. So obviously homeostasis in biology is basically that Goldilocks range of your metabolism, right? So it's your body making sure that certain parameters, pretty much every parameter, that's important in your body doesn't go too high or go too low, right? So it has to make sure you have a certain amount of oxygen in your blood, a certain amount of ions or salt. The acid to base ratio has to be just right, preferably slightly more basic. So all kinds of things, right? So it just has to make sure there's enough of not too much or too little. Blood sugar, red blood cells, white blood cells, anything you could think of, it regulates everything and keeps it in that just right range. So it obviously does that in your brain too with your neurotransmitter levels and your chemical messengers. It has to make sure there aren't too many neurotransmitters that are active at the same time or too little. Now, because this taking drugs disrupts that process, the homeostasis, the body becomes aware of that. So it's not unaware that you're feeling way too good, right? And so when it ends up doing, actually, before I even get into this part, right, because there's something I forgot to say about the dopamine. Now, when dopamine, this is just my understanding of it. I could be wrong. This is my understanding. When dopamine, when you take too much of it, so when you take a drug, right, and a large amount of dopamine becomes active, what ends up happening, right? So your brain will charge the subconscious, and you'll feel really good, which is called the high. But after that, what happens is what's called the crash. So the crash is when you start to feel really bad. So where does that come from? Well, it happens because you pretty much used up your whole supply of dopamine in your brain, or the majority of it. So there's not enough left now to start charging the subconscious at the pleasure frequency. So in other words, there's always a certain amount that's active at one time to make sure you feel good to a certain degree. You don't feel wonderful, but you feel a little bit good. Now, if your dopamine supply is just gone, now your body isn't charging that feel-good feeling at all, or it's charging it very little. So all of a sudden, now you feel terrible, right? Because your body isn't charging that frequency. You used up the supply that it had, which the body would have regulated it properly to make sure you didn't use up that supply. But drugs hacked the process, prevented the body from doing what it normally does, and now you ended up with a very low amount. So you feel horrible, which is called the crash. Now, and that, like I said, disrupts the homeostasis, and the body, if you keep doing that, the body catches on to what's happening, right? And so now it does something to try to resist that, and prevent that from happening. So a lot of times what it does is it'll actually reduce the number of neurotransmitter receptor binding sites. So in other words, remember what I said, that the brain, the number of neurotransmitters that become active at once determines how intensely your brain is charging your subconscious. So if it reduces the number of neurotransmitter sites, right, then you can't charge. No matter what you do, no matter how many drugs you take, your body will never be able to charge the subconscious to a certain level of intensity because that tissue just can't become active enough now. That's what the body's working to prevent, right? And so this is called downregulation. So downregulation, that's the term in, I think, neuroscience and psychology when, so exactly what I said, when the number of neurotransmitters sites reduces. So, and this is one of the other problems with taking drugs, right? It doesn't even make sense because it's not sustainable, right? So when you keep taking drugs, your brain will actually prevent you. It'll change in a way that prevents you from you continuing to use these drugs to reach certain amounts of intensity in your subconscious charge. So there's ultimately no point in even doing it then, because you were doing it originally so your body would charge your subconscious to very high levels of intensity. After a while, it won't even do that. It'll just go to lower levels of intensity. So what's the point? But by the time you reach that point, now your body's addicted, right? So in its addiction, it reaches homeostasis. It only maintains homeostasis if you're taking the drug, right? And there's a million problems with that because a drug is not supposed to be in your body. So it'll just damage your tissue, right? Damages different parts of your body, including damaging the tissue in your brain. So it's not like when it's addicted, you could just keep taking it to maintain that homeostasis level. It would be very expensive generally anyway, but it also damages your body. But even after that problem, right, it eventually leads to withdrawal. So let's say you try to stop taking the drug because it's killing your body from the inside. You can't just keep using at a certain level to maintain homeostasis. When you stop, now the body it's functioning in a way where it expects the drug to come in. So I forgot to say, neurotransmitters obviously regulate probably 100 other things in general, and not just your mood or emotion. So when you stop taking them, or when they go out of whack like that, you're not having them at a degree that represents homeostasis, right? So I mean either you're too little are active, or too many are active at once for your homeostasis level. Then eventually that leads to withdrawal. So in withdrawal, your body will start, it'll kind of go out of whack. So usually it either speeds up a lot in a certain way, which are certain drugs called uppers, basically cause you to kind of breathe more and increase your heart rate. And drugs called downers will generally relax you and calm you down more, slow down your breathing and your heart rate. So usually one of those events happen the moment when your body's in withdrawal and you stop taking the proper amount of drugs to maintain homeostasis. And so that eventually, if a person's in that state, on top of feeling terrible, because they usually don't have enough dopamine, and they're just addicted, and on top of feeling terrible in the withdrawal state, usually their body will, because they're not getting enough, some neurotransmitter's not active enough, or it's too active, I could be wrong about that. I think it's generally just that it's not active enough. But it'll enter more, what's the word I'm looking for? It'll enter kind of that speeding up state. So you'll start breathing heavy and your heart rate will increase, and then you could have a heart attack, right? So, or you can end up not breathing. I could also be wrong about that too. Does that happen in withdrawal? I think it does. This is not really my area. I just studied a whole bunch of stuff. When I was trying to understand the connection between the subconscious and drugs, I did understand it a lot more at the time I wrote the book. But anyway, you get what I'm trying to say, right? So in withdrawal, you actually can end up dying, right, from not having enough of the drug. So you have to slowly get off of it. Or if you're just taking the drug too much, then it'll be too much of your body may have too much of a speeding up response, or it may have too much of a slowing down response. And then that's called overdosing. So, that's what I was trying to say earlier. If you take too much of the drug or too little, you could overdose, either from the body speeding up too much and getting a heart attack, or slowing down too much and you stop breathing. And then the withdrawal is the opposite. So that's when you're not taking enough of the drug, and your body can have some response that causes you to die also. That's what it was. So it's been a while since I wrote that section of the book, so I kind of forgot that, but I just remembered it. But anyway, there are a million things wrong with taking drugs, right? There are a million things wrong with trying to charge the subconscious through the body, because the body is the chemicals in the body that charge the subconscious are also responsible for regulating the body's systems. So you completely can't mess with that, or you shouldn't mess with that at all. The body expects the mind, like I said, to charge the subconscious. So that doesn't really affect the body that much. We will talk about in the next video how it does affect the body, because it does still affect the body, but it's far more of a range, right? It's far safer, in other words. It's far more of a buffer between how your intention impacts the body in terms of it before it's actually dangerous. But in this case, right, it's very dangerous to try to charge the subconscious through the body. So basically, in other words, this is kind of that's kind of what I meant to put in the book, is like a drug-free rant. So you don't want to take drugs, right? You don't want to take recreational drugs and use them to try to feel good or for performance, because some people use them for performance too. It'll alter the brain's chemistry in a way that it kind of allows you to process information quicker and larger amounts of information quicker. So I imagine the body's charging the subconscious transcendental belief, or in a way that affects transcendental intelligence. And remember what I said, transcendental belief has a component that's almost like memory. So it allows you to hold on to a larger and larger and larger number of thoughts, or a larger amount of information in your thoughts at once, and process it all at once. So your body could just charge your subconscious to do that, and that's what some drugs do, and that's bad too, right? So yeah, you don't want to take drugs to do that. You want to use the mind to charge your subconscious to feel good and for performance, right? But just to go to this last point, there are actually good uses of doing this, right? Because remember what we said. Sometimes when a person's born, it's just their genetics, right? Their body or their brain isn't charging the subconscious enough, right? Now, this doesn't make any sense when you're just using it just to feel good and your body's already charging your subconscious in the proper way. What you're supposed to do if you wanted to feel better is just use your mind. But in some cases, though, it's true, the body actually isn't charging the subconscious enough, and this hacking process is actually useful. So, for example, there are I'll just go over this point, there are good uses of drugs in medicine, and certain ones help the body to charge the subconscious in a way that reduces ADHD, for example. So ADHD is basically when your mind is too unfocused. So the brain, remember what I said, the conscious mind in its natural state has awareness and free will, but it doesn't really have rationality. It's more like how it functions in a dream. The brain is the one that charges the subconscious in a way that makes your mind more stable. So it's not all over the place like a dream, and it has rationality. But sometimes the brain is not charging the subconscious at its ground state strong enough to do that. And so that, in those cases, a person has ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, something like that. And so it's harder for them to stay focused. Their mind wanders more, exactly like it does in a dream. So the drug will help the body charge it properly to keep it more still. And that's a good use, right? Now, obviously, that has to be administered by a doctor, a trained physician, because they'll know the right dosage, right? And they'll give you the proper directions to use it so that all this other stuff doesn't happen, right? So when people are depressed, right, they will take a specific drug so that the body is not charging the subconscious to make them feel a certain amount of emotion or feel a certain affinity for feeling a wide array of emotions. The drug will help to basically whatever the brain is doing to charge the subconscious in that way, it'll prevent it or weaken its ability to do that. So, but you have to take it again in the proper amounts. So that's what physicians, that's what the doctors train for. That's what he's there for, to let you know, give you the right dosage, the right medication, and direct you on how to use it. So there are good uses of altering the way the body charges the subconscious through drugs, right? But that, of course, as everyone knows, is done through the proper channels with the doctor. All this other stuff are negative uses, so they're bad uses, and you don't want to do it. So you want to basically learn how to control your subconscious using your mind, right? Not taking drugs. It's a shortcut. It's easier because the mind barely has to do anything. The body will just do all the charging for you, but it'll interfere with your body's regulation systems, and then it could end up killing you, right? So yeah, I think it's important to recognize what's going on at the subconscious level in response to drugs. So I wanted to make this section, but yeah, we're pretty much, like I said, for the rest of the book, we're going to be talking about how to control the subconscious through the mind. Excuse me. So in the next chapter, I'm going to talk about the long-term effects of charging the subconscious with the mind. All right. So yeah, that's pretty much it. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.